The Haunting of Room 13. In the quaint town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the last day of school was always a festive event, filled with laughter, games, and the promise of summer freedom. However, the year 1995 brought a chilling shadow over the town's high school, one that would be remembered for years to come. Room 13 had been locked up and left untouched for nearly 2 decades. It was a place that students whispered about in hushed tones, a room that teachers refused to discuss. The story behind its closure was a tragic one. A beloved teacher, Mrs. Agnes Harper, had died mysteriously in the middle of a lesson back in the 1970s. Her death was sudden and inexplicable. One moment she was teaching, and the next, she collapsed at her desk, never to rise again. The school administration decided to lock the room, leaving everything inside exactly as it was on that fateful day. As the years passed, rumors began to spread. Some said Mrs. Harper's spirit still lingered in the room, while others claimed to hear strange noises, whispers, scratching, and, on rare occasions, the faint sound of a woman weeping. Despite these eerie tales, no one dared to open the door to room 13. That is, until the last day of school in 1995. A group of daring seniors, emboldened by the excitement of their impending graduation, decided to investigate. They were a close-knit group of friends, known for their curiosity and love of a good scare. That day, they hatched a plan to break into room 13 and uncover the truth behind the rumors. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they gathered outside the door just as the sun began to set. With some effort, they managed to force the door open. The creak of the hinges echoed down the empty hallway, sending shivers down their spines. As they stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air grew thick with dust and decay. The room was exactly as it had been left. Desks were arranged in neat rows, papers scattered across the floor, and Mrs. Harper's chair sat eerily in the corner. The friends began to explore, their flashlights flickering in the dim light. One of them, Sarah, noticed something strange, a dark stain on the floor beneath the teacher's desk. As she bent down to get a closer look, a cold breeze brushed past her, making her jump. The others laughed nervously, teasing her for being jumpy, but their laughter quickly died when they heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. The sound seemed to come from all around them, growing louder and more distinct. "Get out," it said, over and over again. Panic set in as they realized they weren't alone. Suddenly, one of the boys, Mark, screamed and pointed to the corner. There, in the shadows, stood a figure, a tall, dark silhouette of a woman with long, flowing hair. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her mouth was twisted into a menacing grin. Terrified, they bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before they could reach it. They pounded on it, screaming for help, but no one heard them. The figure in the corner began to move towards them, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Just as she reached out to touch Sarah, the door flew open, and they tumbled out into the hallway. When they looked back, the door to room 13 was closed once again. They ran all the way home, too scared to look back. The next day, they tried to tell their story, but no one believed them. The door to room 13 was locked once more, and the principal claimed it had never been opened. But the friends knew what they had seen, and they never spoke of it again. To this day, the door to room 13 remains closed, and students still hear strange noises coming from within. Those who dare to listen closely say they can hear the faint sound of a woman crying, as if she's trapped inside, waiting for someone to release her. The Vanishing Bus. In the summer of 1982, the town of Hollow Creek, Maine, was shaken by an event that would leave an indelible mark on its history. The last day of school was always a time of joy and celebration, but that year, it became a nightmare that no one could ever forget. The day started like any other, with children excitedly boarding the school bus for the final ride home before summer vacation. The bus driver, Mr. Wilkins, was a well-liked man in his late 50s, known for his jovial demeanor and fondness for the children he transported daily. As the bus made its usual rounds, the students chatted excitedly about their summer plans, oblivious to the fact that they would never make it home that day. The route was familiar, a winding path through the outskirts of town that eventually led into the dense Hollow Creek forest. But on this day, something was different. As the bus entered the forest, the children noticed that Mr. Wilkins was taking an unfamiliar turn. The trees grew denser, and the road became narrow and overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in years. The chatter on the bus slowly died down as an uneasy silence settled over the group. "Mr. Wilkins, where are we going?" a young girl named Emily asked, her voice trembling with fear. The driver didn't respond. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his face devoid of any emotion. The children began to panic, some crying, others clinging to their seats as the bus ventured deeper into the forest. Hours passed, and the bus continued to drive with no sign of stopping. Back in town, parents grew worried as their children failed to arrive home. Calls to the school revealed that the bus had left on time, but no one had seen it since. Panic quickly spread through the community, and search parties were organized to comb the area. As night fell, the bus still hadn't been found. Search teams scoured the forest, calling out the names of the children, but there was no response. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant hooting of an owl. The entire town was on edge, fearing the worst. Then, just as hope was beginning to fade, a search party stumbled upon something deep in the forest, the bus. It was parked in a small clearing, hidden from the road by a thick wall of trees. The headlights were on, casting an eerie glow in the darkness, but the bus was empty. The doors were open, and inside, the seats were covered in a fine layer of dust, as if the bus had been abandoned for years. The searchers called out, their voices echoing through the trees, but there was no sign of the children or Mr. Wilkins. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The only clue left behind was a single note, scrawled on the blackboard at the front of the bus: "They took us." The townspeople were left baffled and heartbroken. No trace of the children or the bus driver was ever found, despite extensive searches that continued for months. The forest became a place of fear, and no one dared to venture into its depths. The story of the vanishing bus became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among the children of Hollow Creek. To this day, some locals claim that on the anniversary of that fateful day, you can hear the distant sound of a school bus driving through the forest. If you listen closely, they say, you can hear the laughter of children, growing fainter and fainter, until it disappears altogether, swallowed by the trees. The Substitute. In the spring of 2003, in the quiet town of Cedar Hill, Ohio, the last day of school was anything but ordinary. It was a day that would haunt the students of Cedar Hill Middle School for years to come, a day when they encountered something, or someone, far beyond their understanding. The day began like any other, with students eagerly anticipating the final bell that would signal the start of summer vacation. However, when they arrived in Mrs. Jennings's 8th grade classroom, they were met with an unexpected surprise: a substitute teacher. Mrs. Jennings had called in sick, and in her place stood a tall, imposing woman with long, dark hair and piercing blue eyes. The woman introduced herself as Miss Blackwell. She was dressed in a severe black dress, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her expression was stern, and her voice was cold and emotionless as she addressed the class. "Good morning, students," she said, her eyes sweeping over them. "Today, we will be discussing something very important: the inevitability of death." The students exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the light-hearted lesson they had expected on their last day of school. Miss Blackwell began to write on the chalkboard, her handwriting sharp and angular. She spoke in a monotone, explaining the different ways people throughout history had met their end: wars, plagues, natural disasters. The students listened in stunned silence, their excitement for the day draining away with each word she spoke. As the morning wore on, a strange feeling settled over the classroom. The air seemed to grow thicker, and a sense of dread filled the room. Some students began to feel unwell, headaches, nausea, and an overwhelming sense of fear that they couldn't explain. A few even fainted, their pale faces a stark contrast to Miss Blackwell's unyielding gaze. When one brave student, Michael, raised his hand and asked about her background, Miss Blackwell fixed him with an icy stare.